Roswell Incident, the terrifying truth they don't want you to know. The recording was never supposed to exist, but when the audio clicked on, the sound was deafening, static, crackling, and then a voice whispered, "They're not dead. They're waiting." Seconds later, a blood-curdling scream. It didn't sound human, and then silence. In the desolate wastelands of Roswell, New Mexico, where the air feels like it's charged with a static that never truly dissipates, there lies a forgotten path, one deliberately omitted from maps and erased from official memory. The road, cracked and overrun with jagged desert plants, leads to what was once a hub of secrecy, the remnants of an abandoned military testing site. For decades, rumors have circulated about what really happened there. People spoke of strange lights in the night sky, unmarked black helicopters that arrived without warning, and the occasional missing hiker whose disappearance was chalked up to dehydration or wild animals. But James Wheeler wasn't interested in rumors. He wanted facts. As a freelance journalist with a penchant for uncovering government conspiracies, James had made a career out of digging where he wasn't welcome. When the envelope arrived at his doorstep, no return address, sealed with tape, his curiosity ignited like a spark in dry grass. The contents were cryptic. A map, hand-drawn and yellowed with age, marked with a single red X on the outskirts of Roswell. Alongside it, a photograph, grainy, almost indecipherable, showing what looked like an underground corridor, illuminated by flickering lights. Scribbled on the back of the photo was a single line: "Do you know what you're looking for?" It was the kind of message James lived for, tantalizingly vague and ominous. He packed his camera, flashlight, and a notebook, and by sundown, he was driving into the vast emptiness of the desert. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. Cell service disappeared, and the only sound was the crunch of tires on gravel and the occasional gust of wind that howled through the open windows of his Jeep. When he arrived at the site, it was clear no one had been there for years. The entrance to the bunker was partially obscured by sand and debris, its steel doors rusted and riddled with dents, as if something or someone had tried to get out. The surrounding area was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. James hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the latch. He had been in dangerous situations before, abandoned asylums, war zones, but there was something different about this place. It felt wrong, as though the very ground beneath his feet was warning him to leave. Ignoring the prickling unease crawling up his spine, he yanked the door open. The sound was deafening in the stillness, a metallic groan that echoed into the darkness below. The air that rushed out was foul, damp, and metallic, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay. James turned on his flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through the oppressive blackness of the corridor. The walls were lined with peeling paint and rusted pipes that dripped an oily black substance onto the floor. With each step, the air grew colder, and the faint hum of electricity became audible, a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate through his bones. The corridor stretched on, twisting and turning like a maze, until he came upon a heavy steel door at the end. Painted in faded red letters were the words, "Biological Containment." James hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But curiosity, as always, overrode caution. He pressed his hand against the door, feeling its cold surface beneath his palm, and pushed it open. The room beyond was vast and dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The floor was littered with strange objects, pieces of broken equipment, shattered glass, and what looked like bones. But what immediately caught his attention were the figures sprawled across the floor. At first glance, they appeared to be mannequins, their pale, hairless forms unnaturally still. But as he stepped closer, his flashlight revealed details that froze him in place. The thin, translucent skin stretched taut over elongated limbs, the misshapen skulls with no discernible mouths, and the black, glossy eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. James's breath hitched. He had seen photos of supposed alien bodies before, those infamous black and white images that conspiracy theorists waved around like gospel. But this was different. These weren't bodies that had been dissected or preserved. They looked untouched, as if they had simply fallen where they lay. And yet, their skin twitched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a faint ripple like the surface of water disturbed by a pebble. One of the creatures, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, seemed to be staring directly at him. The glossy, bottomless eyes were unblinking, but James couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of him, that it was watching. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered. He smacked it against his palm, trying to steady the beam, but the light died entirely. The room plunged into darkness, and with it came a sound. A low, mechanical whine that grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening. James fumbled for his camera, its flash becoming his only source of light. With each burst, the room was illuminated for a fraction of a second, and in those fleeting glimpses, the figures on the floor seemed to shift. One moment they were still, the next they were closer. The camera clicked frantically, capturing fragmented images of their distorted forms until the sound stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the noise. James's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. Then came the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A soft, rhythmic clicking, like the tapping of claws against metal. It started faintly, somewhere in the shadows, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be circling him. Panic set in, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. He swung the flashlight around, desperate to see what was out there, but the light refused to work. And then, in the pitch-black darkness, he felt it, a cold, skeletal hand brushing against the back of his neck. The room was suffocating, a tomb of stale air and festering silence that seemed to press against James's chest with every shallow breath. The stench was unbearable, thick, acrid, and clinging to his nostrils as if it had a life of its own. It wasn't just the ammonia or the sickly sweet undertone of rot. There was something else, something alien in the air, a scent that triggered an instinctual revulsion deep in his gut. His flashlight flickered weakly as he moved closer to the sprawled figures on the floor, each step accompanied by the crunch of glass shards and the sticky squelch of something unidentifiable beneath his boots. His mind raced to rationalize what he was seeing, but no explanation made sense. These weren't mannequins or dummies. They were things, their anatomy grotesquely warped yet eerily symmetrical, as if they had been crafted by a sculptor with no understanding of human proportions. The figure's limbs were impossibly long and thin, their skin almost translucent, stretched taut over bones that seemed too numerous, too jagged to belong to anything from Earth. Veins crisscrossed beneath their flesh like pale blue webs, pulsing faintly in the dim light. The eyes were the worst, two perfect black voids, glossy and unblinking, reflecting nothing yet seemingly seeing everything. James tried to focus on anything else, but his gaze kept returning to those eyes. They weren't just dead. They were wrong. They seemed to radiate an intelligence far beyond comprehension, something cold and calculating that sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up his spine. As he approached, his boots slipped on the slick floor, nearly sending him crashing into one of the bodies. He caught himself, his hand instinctively bracing against a nearby console covered in dust and strange markings. His fingers brushed against something wet and warm. Blood. Or at least it looked like blood. It was darker than it should have been, almost black, with a viscosity that clung to his skin. He recoiled, wiping his hand on his jeans, but the substance left behind a faint burning sensation as if it were eating into his flesh. He stared at the stain on his pants, panic beginning to claw at the edges of his mind. And then, the body closest to him moved. It wasn't a sudden jerk or a twitch, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the shifting of a shadow when a light flickers. But James saw it, and every muscle in his body locked in place. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, as his mind struggled to process what he had just witnessed. The creature's chest, which he had assumed was caved in and lifeless, rose and fell in the faintest imitation of breathing. A soft, wet sound, like the sucking of mud, escaped its throat, or what he thought was its throat. The buzzing sound in the room intensified, a high-pitched whine that seemed to drill into his skull. James clapped a hand over his ear, but it didn't help. The noise wasn't external. It was inside him, vibrating through his teeth, his bones, his very thoughts. His flashlight faltered again, casting the room in bursts of light and shadow. Each flash illuminated something he hadn't noticed before. Symbols carved into the walls, spiraling and intersecting in patterns that hurt to look at. Broken equipment sparking faintly, wires trailing across the floor like veins in a living organism. And the bodies, those horrifying, impossible bodies, beginning to shift, their movements slow but deliberate. One of them, the nearest to him, turned its head. The motion was unnatural, like a marionette's strings being yanked too hard. Its neck twisted too far, the bones cracking audibly as it fixed its empty black gaze on him. James stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He felt the weight of its stare, not just on his skin but in his mind, a suffocating pressure that seemed to root itself deep in his brain. The creature didn't move any closer, but its eyes, they were doing something to him. Thoughts that weren't his own began to bubble to the surface, fragmented and incomprehensible. Images of stars collapsing, of planets devoured by blackness, of screams that stretched across galaxies. "Stop," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice barely carried in the oppressive stillness. The creature tilted its head, as if it understood, as if it were mocking him. Its thin, spindly fingers twitched, the joints bending backward at impossible angles. The sound of clicking filled the air, soft at first, then louder, more rhythmic, echoing through the room like a predator announcing its presence. James fumbled for his camera, his shaking hands barely able to grip it. The flash became his lifeline, a burst of light that cut through the suffocating darkness. He clicked once, twice, 3 times, capturing fragmented images of the room. In one frame, the creature was lying on the floor. In the next, it was crouched, its limbs contorted and ready to spring. The third flash revealed it looming over him, its face inches from his own. He dropped the camera with a strangled cry, scrambling backward as his flashlight sputtered back to life. The creature was gone, or so he thought. The clicking sound persisted, now joined by a faint whispering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. James whipped around, his flashlight darting across the room. The bodies were no longer on the floor. They were standing, impossibly tall and thin, their heads tilted at grotesque angles as they watched him with those unblinking black eyes. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of alien syllables that burrowed into his mind like parasites. James backed into the wall, his chest heaving as panic overtook him. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and insect-like, its elongated fingers reaching out toward him. The air around him seemed to warp, growing heavier, thicker, as if reality itself was breaking apart. And then, just as the creature's hand was about to touch him, the room was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the oppressive void. James's breathing was the only thing he could hear, shallow and rapid, like a trapped animal. And then, from the pitch-black abyss, came the voice. Low, guttural, and impossibly close, it whispered 3 words that sent ice coursing through his veins. "It will wake." James didn't remember moving. One moment he was frozen in suffocating darkness, the alien's guttural whisper burrowing into his brain like a parasite. The next, he was running, stumbling, crashing into walls as he barreled down the corridor from which he'd come. His flashlight swung wildly in his trembling hand, its beam flickering like a dying pulse, casting jagged shadows that danced on the cracked, peeling walls. The corridor seemed longer now, impossibly stretched, as if the bunker itself was alive, warping to trap him inside its bowels. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the sound of his frantic footsteps, but not the whispers. No, The whispers were still there, clinging to him like a second skin. They weren't coming from behind him, nor from the empty space ahead. They were inside his head. A cacophony of inhuman voices murmuring secrets he couldn't understand. And yet, something in those whispers was familiar. They weren't just speaking to him, they were learning him, sifting through his memories like fingers rifling through the pages of an old book. Flashes of his childhood bubbled up unbidden. The time he broke his arm falling from a tree. The sound of his mother's laughter as she bandaged him up. The night he cried himself to sleep when his dog didn't come home. But these memories weren't comforting. They were invasive, grotesquely vivid, as though someone else was inside them with him, watching, dissecting, understanding. He shook his head violently, trying to shove the images away, but they only grew stronger, more intimate. And beneath it all, that guttural phrase repeated over and over, each syllable reverberating in his skull. "It will wake. It will wake." The flashlight's beam faltered again, and James skidded to a halt, gasping for air. He leaned against the wall, its surface cold and damp, and forced himself to breathe. His chest heaved, his lungs burning as though the very air was poisoned. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not just from behind, but from every angle, above, below, within. The corridor stretched ahead of him, dark and unyielding, but he felt no safer standing still than he did moving forward. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but where would he go? The surface felt miles away, an unreachable dream in this endless nightmare. And then he heard it, the clicking. Soft at first, like the distant tap of rain against glass, it grew louder, sharper, echoing off the walls with an unnatural rhythm. It wasn't just one sound, it was many, overlapping and chaotic, like the movements of countless legs skittering across metal. James's blood ran cold. He turned, his flashlight trembling as it barely pierced the darkness, and saw nothing. But the sound was closer now, impossibly close, as though it were right behind him. He took a step back, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor, and the clicking stopped. The silence was worse, oppressive and deafening. "Hello?" James's voice cracked, barely audible over the pounding in his chest. He hated how weak he sounded, how small. He swung the flashlight around again, desperately scanning the corridor, and that's when he saw it. A shadow. It was fleeting, barely more than a blur at the edge of the light, but it was there. A hunched, skittering form that vanished as soon as it appeared. James's breath caught in his throat. He froze, every muscle in his body taut, waiting for it to return. The seconds dragged on like hours, each heartbeat thundering in his ears, until finally the shadow reappeared. This time, it was closer. The creature emerged fully into the beam of his flashlight, and James almost dropped it in terror. It wasn't like the bodies he'd seen earlier. This was something alive, something far worse. Its skin was a sickly grey-green, mottled with patches of black that pulsed like diseased veins. It moved on all fours, its limbs grotesquely long and jointed in unnatural places like the legs of a spider. Its head was bulbous and smooth, with no mouth or nose, just those same black, featureless eyes that seemed to devour the light. The clicking noise came from its claws, thin, jagged appendages that scraped against the floor as it crept toward him, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the chase. James couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot as the creature drew closer. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying him, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he thought he saw something inside those black eyes. A flicker of movement, a reflection of something vast and terrible. And then it lunged. The flashlight clattered to the floor as James scrambled backward, narrowly avoiding the swipe of its claws. The beam spun wildly, casting the corridor in a chaotic strobe of light and shadow. The creature was fast, unnaturally fast, its limbs bending and contorting as it darted after him. James ran blindly, his hands scraping against the walls as he struggled to stay upright. The corridor twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, the walls seeming to close in around him. He turned a corner and slammed into a door, heavy, metal, and locked. Panic surged through him as he tugged at the handle, his fingers slipping on the cold steel. Behind him, the clicking grew louder, closer. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw it crawling along the ceiling, its head twisted upside down, those soulless eyes fixed on him. "No, no, no," James screamed, banging on the door with both fists. He didn't care who heard him anymore. He just wanted out. The creature dropped to the floor with a sickening thud, its limbs splaying out like a grotesque marionette. It was only a few feet away now, its body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. In a desperate frenzy, James reached into his pocket and pulled out his camera. He didn't know what he was thinking. Maybe he hoped the flash would scare it off, or maybe he just wanted proof of what was about to kill him. He raised the camera, his hands trembling, and pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the corridor for a split second, and what he saw made his stomach turn. The creature wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, clinging to the walls and ceiling, their black eyes glittering like shards of obsidian. They moved in perfect unison, their limbs clicking as they crawled closer, surrounding him. The flash faded, plunging him back into darkness. But their presence was unmistakable. He could feel them. Their cold, wet breath on the back of his neck, the soft scrape of claws against metal as they closed in. James's mind spiraled into chaos. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a game, and he was the prey. James was losing his grip on reality. He could feel it slipping through his fingers like water in a clenched fist. The walls of the bunker seemed alive now, pulsating faintly in the flickering light of his flashlight, which he had miraculously snatched off the floor in his panic. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears, and the stale air tasted metallic in his mouth. There was no escape. Not here. Not now. The creatures, those impossible things, were no longer just in the shadows. They were a constant, malignant presence in his mind. It was as though they were feeding off his fear, savoring every drop of his terror, like a predator toying with its prey before the final, inevitable kill. The camera still hung around his neck, its strap digging into his skin as he ran, tripping and stumbling over the uneven floor. The flashes of the camera had offered brief glimpses of his pursuers, but each burst of light had only made the darkness that followed feel heavier, thicker, like a tangible thing pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the image of those creatures, dozens of them, crawling, writhing, their limbs contorted into grotesque shapes that defied any natural anatomy. Their black eyes seemed to see everything, their gazes piercing through walls, through flesh, through his very soul. And now the whispers were louder. They weren't just murmurs anymore, they were chants, overlapping and discordant, forming a sinister melody that crawled into his brain and refused to leave. He couldn't understand the words. They were guttural, alien, and yet there was something hauntingly familiar about them. They sounded old, ancient, as though they predated language itself. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside him, wrapping around his thoughts like vines choking the life from a tree. He turned a corner, his flashlight beam catching a glimpse of something that made his stomach churn. A doorway, slightly ajar, with a faint pulsating light emanating from within. The light wasn't natural. It was a sickly green hue, flickering erratically like a dying flame. James hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But the sound of the clicking behind him left him no choice. He had to move forward. He had to see what was in that room. Pushing the door open with trembling hands, he stepped inside and immediately regretted it. The room was massive, far larger than it should have been given the size of the bunker. The walls were lined with strange metallic panels, etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them. In the center of the room was a table, or at least something that resembled a table. It was metallic, but the surface pulsed as though it were alive, veins of green light snaking across it in intricate patterns. And on the table lay a body. James's breath caught in his throat as he approached the figure, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The body wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too short, and the head was massive, with no mouth or nose, just those same black eyes that seemed to haunt every corner of this nightmare. The creature's skin was pale, almost translucent, and its chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. It was alive. For a moment, James thought about running. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to get out of there, to leave this thing and never look back. But something held him in place, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what he was seeing. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room, and that's when he saw it. The markings on the creature's skin. They weren't scars or tattoos, they were carvings, deep and deliberate, etched into its flesh with precision. The symbols matched the ones on the walls, the ones on the table, and as James stared at them, he felt a strange sensation wash over him. It was as though the symbols were moving, shifting beneath the creature's skin, forming new patterns that his brain struggled to comprehend. His vision blurred, and he stumbled back, clutching his head as a wave of nausea overtook him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and James realized with a start that they were coming from the creature. Its chest continued to rise and fall, but now its eyes were open, those black, bottomless eyes staring directly at him. He couldn't look away. It was as though the creature had reached into his mind and taken hold of him, pulling him closer with an invisible force. His flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor, but he didn't notice. All he could see were those eyes. Images flooded his mind, flashes of places he'd never been, of worlds he couldn't possibly know. He saw barren landscapes bathed in harsh, unearthly light, towering structures that defied physics, their surfaces shimmering with impossible colors, and skies filled with stars that pulsed like living things. He saw them, the creatures. Not just the ones here in the bunker, but thousands of them, millions, their forms shifting and evolving as they moved through time and space. He saw them descending on Earth, their black eyes filled with a cold, predatory hunger. And then he saw himself. He was lying on the table, his body stripped of all humanity, his skin etched with those same symbols, his eyes black and empty. The vision was so vivid, so real, that he screamed, stumbling backward and breaking free of the creature's gaze. The images vanished, leaving him gasping for air, his chest heaving as though he'd just run a marathon. The creature on the table didn't move, but its eyes followed him as he backed away. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices chanting in unison, their words forming a single horrifying phrase, "It will wake, it will wake." James turned and ran, his mind racing as fast as his feet. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from that room, from that creature, from those symbols that seemed to burn into his brain. But as he sprinted down the corridor, the whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. And somewhere, in the distance, the clicking began again. James's legs burned as he ran through the suffocating darkness of the bunker's labyrinthine corridors. Each step seemed heavier than the last, his breaths coming in ragged, panicked gasps that echoed unnaturally in the claustrophobic space. The air felt oppressive, thick with an almost tangible weight, and the whispers had grown into a cacophony of unintelligible voices. They overlapped and collided, forming a sound so chaotic that it threatened to split his mind apart. His flashlight flickered weakly in his trembling hand, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. Yet he dared not stop, because now he wasn't just running from the creatures. He was running from something far worse. Somewhere behind him, the clicking sounds had evolved into a grotesque symphony of wet, guttural noises, as though the bunker itself was breathing, alive and hungry. The walls, damp and glistening, seemed to shift and ripple in the dim light, the alien symbols carved into the surface glowing faintly, as if mocking his desperate attempts to escape. He tried to focus on the path ahead, but his vision blurred, distorted by the vivid afterimages of what he had seen in the pulsating room. That thing, The creature with the black, soulless eyes was still burned into his mind like a brand. As he turned a corner, he nearly tripped over his own feet, colliding with the wall and sending his flashlight skittering across the floor. It spun wildly, casting erratic beams of light that danced across the corridor like phantoms. James scrambled to retrieve it, his shaking hands betraying his mounting terror. When he finally grasped the flashlight and turned it toward the path he had come from, he froze. The corridor behind him was empty, but the shadows were wrong. They stretched unnaturally long, curling and twisting as though they had minds of their own. He squinted, trying to convince himself it was a trick of the flickering light, but then he saw movement. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the darkness like a predator slinking just beyond the edge of visibility. Then, it became undeniable. The shadows weren't just moving, they were approaching. James stumbled backward, his flashlight trembling as the shadows coalesced into a form. It was humanoid, but only in the vaguest sense. Its body was a mass of writhing black tendrils, each one undulating with a sickening serpentine motion. Its head was featureless except for two glowing orbs where eyes should have been, bright, white-hot pinpricks of light that seemed to pierce directly into his soul. The whispers surged in volume, the overlapping voices now forming words he could almost understand. Almost. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the floor as his surroundings blurred into a disorienting mess of metallic walls and alien symbols. The corridors seemed endless, looping back on themselves, and no matter how far he ran, the whispers never faded. The thing was following him, its tendrils scraping against the walls with a sound that made his teeth ache. Worse still, the bunker itself seemed to be shifting, the hallways warping and elongating as though the entire structure was alive and playing with him. And then, without warning, he reached a dead end. James skidded to a halt, his heart sinking as he stared at the solid metal wall before him. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed faintly, almost mockingly, as if they were laughing at his predicament. He spun around, his back pressed against the cold metal, his flashlight aimed down the corridor. The thing was there, standing still in the distance, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, it began to move. The creature advanced slowly, deliberately, its tendrils slithering across the floor and walls with an organic wetness that made James's stomach churn. He raised his camera reflexively, snapping a photo in a desperate bid to ward it off. The flash lit up the corridor for a split second, and in that brief moment, James saw something that made his blood run cold. The creature wasn't alone. Behind it, emerging from the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling, were dozens, no, hundreds, of identical entities. Their bodies twisted and writhed as they emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes locked onto him. The whispers reached a fever pitch, the alien voices now screaming incomprehensibly in his ears. He dropped the camera, clutching his head as pain lanced through his skull like a hot knife. "It will wake," the voices said, their tone unified and deafening. "You will see." James collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face as the creatures closed in. His mind felt like it was unraveling, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving into nothingness. He could feel them, inside him, probing his thoughts, his memories, his fears. They were digging, searching for something, and the sensation was worse than any physical pain he had ever experienced. Just as the nearest creature reached out with its tendrils, James was blinded by a sudden, searing light. The corridor was flooded with an intense white glow, and the creatures recoiled, their forms dissolving into the shadows like mist under the morning sun. James shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as he tried to comprehend what was happening. When the light finally faded, he found himself in a completely different place. The bunker was gone, replaced by a vast, barren landscape bathed in an eerie, otherworldly light. The sky above was a swirling mass of colors that defied description, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum that vibrated through his entire body. In the distance, towering monolithic structures loomed, their surfaces shimmering with the same alien symbols he had seen in the bunker. James staggered to his feet, his mind racing. He was no longer on Earth. He was sure of it. This was their world, their domain, and he was an intruder. The whispers were gone, replaced by an overwhelming silence that was somehow even more terrifying. And then he saw it. Far on the horizon, something was rising. It was massive, its form too immense to fully comprehend. It towered over the monoliths, its body a writhing mass of tendrils and glowing eyes. James could feel its gaze on him, even from this distance, and the sheer weight of its presence brought him to his knees. The camera, still hanging from his neck, clicked on its own, taking a photo. The flash illuminated the creature for a fraction of a second, and James realized with a horrifying clarity that this was what they had been protecting. This was the truth. They didn't want anyone to know. As the thing began to move toward him, James closed his eyes, the camera slipping from his grasp. The last thing he heard was the sound of the shutter clicking one final time, capturing the end of everything. If you want to hear more chilling stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. There's more to this world than meets the eye, and I'll be here to uncover it. What if the Roswell crash wasn't a crash at all, but a prison break?